So hello and welcome to our audience to today's health panel for Toronto Veg Food Fest. This is organised by Toronto Vegetarian Association. The panel today is co-hosted by Plant-Based Canada, and we thank TVA for this opportunity to participate this year. So today's health panel will be on the health impact of our current food systems. We will be concentrating on the infectious diseases aspect of it. We'll talk a lot about pandemics, which is the issue of the moment, and we'll also talk about foodborne illnesses and antibiotic resistance. Today we have a very distinguished panel of health professionals, all physicians. We have Dr. David Jenkins, Dr. Maria Theodorou, and Dr. Tushar Mehta. My name is Dr. Zahra Kassam. I'll be moderating the session today. I'm going to take a few minutes to introduce our panelists and to thank them as well for the time and sharing their expertise with us today. And then we'll get on with the discussion. So first of all, we'll introduce Dr. David Jenkins. He is a university professor and Canada Research Chair in the Departments of Nutritional Sciences and Medicine, a staff physician in the Division of Endocrinology and Metabolism, the director of the Clinical Nutrition and Risk Factor Modification Center, and a scientist in the Li Ka-shing Knowledge Institute at St. Michael's Hospital in Toronto. He was educated at Oxford University, obtaining his DM, DPhil, and DSc there. He has served on committees in Canada and the US that formulated nutritional guidelines for the treatment of diabetes and recommendations for fiber and macronutrient intake under the joint US-Canada DRI system of the National Academy of Sciences. He has spent much time working with the food industry to develop products for the supermarket shelf. For example, he helped to initiate Loblaw's Too Good to Be True and their popular Blue menu line of products. His research area is in the use of diet in the prevention and treatment of hyperlipidemia and diabetes, and he has over 300 original publications. His team was the first to define and explore the concept of the glycemic index of foods and demonstrate the breadth of metabolic effects of viscous soluble fiber, including blood glucose and cholesterol lowering. His group developed the cholesterol lowering concept of the dietary portfolio that has entered guidelines in many jurisdictions, and he believes in the therapeutic value of plant-based diets and that diets have to be environmentally sustainable. And I'll just make a plug here for a book that your family, what an amazing family, your two daughters, your sister and your wife have done based on your portfolio diet, the use of your portfolio diet for lowering and reducing the risk for cardiovascular disease. Do you want to say a few words about that? Because it's awesome.
Thank you very much. No, that's very kind of you, Zahra. No, my daughters especially work tremendously hard, as is my wife. And I'm very proud of it. So it's a major conflict of interest of mine. We just wished it was cheaper.
Indeed. Thank you. Our second panelist is Dr. Maria Theodorou, who is an internal medicine specialist with a passion for empowering patients to take charge of their own health. After spending many years on the medical wards and in the ICU, treating patients with the end stages of lifestyle-related disease, Dr. Theodorou became motivated to focus on the prevention and reversal of chronic disease through intensive lifestyle intervention, including evidence-based nutrition, physical activity, and stress management. In 2017, she was amongst only a handful of physicians in Canada to be awarded certification in lifestyle medicine by the American Board of Lifestyle Medicine, and subsequently launched a lifestyle medicine practice in Kingston, Ontario. And this is not in your bio, but I understand that you actually sat next to the great Dr. Michael Greger at that exam.
I did. It was a little nerve-wracking.
Wonderful. In addition to her Kingston practice, she licensed in BC, where she provides telemedicine consultations for Aroga Lifestyle Medicine in Victoria, one of the most comprehensive lifestyle medicine practices in North America. Dr. Theodorou holds a PhD in plant biology from Queen's University and postdoctoral fellowship from the University of Oxford. So you and Dr. Jenkins are connected that way. When she is not busy advocating for her patients or dissecting the medical literature, she enjoys running, tennis, and bodybuilding. How wonderful. Our last panelist, but not least by any means, is Dr. Tushar Mehta. Dr. Mehta is an ER physician working in Brampton and Georgetown, Ontario. He has practiced family and addictions medicine in the past. Over the years, he has worked with Project Canoe, a Toronto-based organization serving youth, conducted medical outreach with village schools in Kutch in India, and he currently works with Health Education Project Haiti. Tushar is very interested in the evidence for plant-based diet as it impacts human health and global ecology. He is currently reviewing evidence for the role of animal agriculture in viral pandemics. And along with a small team, he has created a freely accessible database of literature. And this is www.plantbaseddata.org. And this is such an amazing resource. It's one of a kind. I really encourage everyone to go and check that out. Tushar, do you have anything extra to add about your data set there?
Just that the database project is new, although we've been collecting data for many years now. And the great thing is that we're expanding our team. We're going to have some people doing blogs online with medium.com, and another team member that's going to help us make videos. So as we grow, hopefully we'll be doing better outreach and communication, and get stronger at collecting data and organizing it.
Wonderful, thank you. So do check it out. Okay, so now we'll get going with our discussion. Maria, I'm going to ask you a very basic question because this is what our discussion is actually based upon. What is the definition of a zoonotic disease, and can you give us some examples?
Yeah, so, even having gone to medical school, I hadn't fully appreciated how many existing infectious diseases and emerging infectious diseases are actually of animal origin. So the definition of a zoonotic illness is that it's an infectious disease that's caused by a pathogen, such as a bacteria, a virus, a fungus, or a prion that has jumped from animals, usually vertebrates, to humans. And that first infected human will then infect another, and so human transmission is also part of the definition. Pretty much, almost all of the infectious diseases I can think of have zoonotic origin. So some common examples of bacterial diseases, and some that we see in the ICU, include Salmonella and toxigenic E. coli and Campylobacter, all of which cause gastrointestinal illness. These bacteria live in the intestinal tracts of animals, such as chickens in the case of Salmonella, and contaminate our foods or food surfaces, or contaminate other surfaces like in our kitchen, and can ultimately infect humans and cause disease. We also have diseases like Clostridium difficile, I think, which is now called Clostridioides difficile, which is a superbug in meat. And we used to believe that this was hospital acquired. But find after some research that only about a third of the cases can be linked to hospital transmission, and that we know now that a significant portion of packaged meats are contaminated with Clostridium difficile. So that's pretty surprising to me as an intensivist who always believed that this was just a hospital acquired bug. Examples of viruses, so we've been battling with HIV for years, no vaccine yet. This was transmitted from primates to humans, possibly by the consumption of bushmeat. Then most recently, we're all concerned with the coronaviruses, some of which cause the common cold, but others of which cause severe disease, such as SARS-CoV-1, which we had an outbreak of in 2003, and Toronto was actually a big hotspot for that. Globally, about 8,000 cases and 774 deaths. MERS, Middle Eastern Respiratory Syndrome, and this was also from animal source. I think speculated that it could have come from camels, first reported in 2012, still out there and exists. And then, we have the Spanish flu, which occurred in 1918 and is felt to have originated in North American wild and domesticated birds. And then there's, the fear of another sort of a bird flu with like H5N1, which is the reservoir is in farmed birds. or swine flu, which caused the 2009 flu pandemic. You know, a lot of the things that we deal with and will be dealing with in the future are of zoonotic or animal origin. And, you know, even things like TB, which, you know, even, you know, goats and cows. So there, you know, so many of the diseases that we deal with are of zoonotic origin.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maria. And you touched upon our next question as well, about the food poisoning, and you mentioned some of those pathogens. People don't realize that thousands of people every year are affected by food poisoning from our food. Can you speak to this issue and give us some specific examples of that, and just give us an idea of the scope of this problem? I'll put that out to all three of you.
I'm happy to address that. There's like more than 250 types of foodborne illnesses caused by, like I said, a wide variety of bacteria, viruses, and parasites. And the top 4 pathogens in Canada are norovirus, Salmonella, C. perfringens, and Campylobacter. And then there's others that are less common but can also result in hospitalization, such as Listeria, toxigenic E. coli. Like I said, many of these are from reservoirs found in the intestinal tracts of farmed animals and get transmitted to humans. And that contamination can occur anywhere along the food chain, from the processing plants to the delivery systems to in the grocery store when you handle the, you know, the grocery cart, which may be contaminated. So even, you know, vegans are at risk. You know, runoff from fecal matter from large industrial farms to fields can contaminate crop plants. So, you know, plants are also susceptible.
Any other
I think
comments?
I think it's a very important point that you raised. I mean, Walkerton, which we had here in Ontario, resulted in deaths of children, basically from the runoff from pig farming with antibiotic use and the leaching into the groundwater of E. coli. And I think that was part of the real problem that they had. And this was a very serious problem. And the trouble is, instead of blaming the farm, they blamed the guy who should have been testing the water. Yeah. So we always tend to do the thing downstream instead of really going to source.
Indeed, yes, I remember that. Tragic. Yes, and absolutely. You know, we hear about these isolated episodes, but it's far wider than that.
Yes.
And we, based on the data, 1 in 8 Canadians every year will be affected by food poisoning. There's about 12,000 hospitalizations and a few hundred deaths related to that. Absolutely. Now, does proper does proper cooking kill the bugs?
So generally, yes, thoroughly cooking food, both plant and animal, kills most of the pathogens. However, there are a few exceptions. So cooking will not kill off Clostridium difficile or Clostridium perfringens spores, which are quite resistant to heat and can survive cooking at the recommended temperatures. So 71 degrees Celsius is the recommended cooking temperature or internal temperature for most meats. And you can cook at that temperature for 2 hours and still not kill off C. diff. You know, for meats, it's not just, you know, what you do during the cooking period. It's, you know, one has to be very careful handling the raw meat or poultry prior to cooking. And, you know, the CDC even advises that one not wash or rinse the poultry or meat prior to cooking, as this will contaminate your kitchen surfaces and you can get it that way. You know, for plants, you want to wash your hands and all your utensils prior to handling the plants, because your kitchen may be contaminated, especially if you know, live with an omnivore.
Indeed. Thank you. Any other comments before we move on? So we'll move on to antibiotic resistance. We hear a lot about antibiotic resistance, but mainly in the context of the narrative of physicians perhaps overprescribing antibiotics for conditions that either don't require it or don't respond to antibiotics. But in fact, a significant part of this issue comes from our food practices. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, so Zahra, that is so true. And again, something I wasn't aware of as I was going through medical school. And what most people don't realize is that the vast majority of global antibiotic use is for farm animals. In Canada, that figure is 82%. So over 80% of the antibiotics that we produce in Canada go towards administration to land animals. You know, that makes some sense because we're outnumbered severely by the number of land animals that are grown and slaughtered each year in Canada by about 20-1. But these animals are grown in horrific and overcrowded conditions, and antibiotics are used to treat disease in these animals. But one thing that I've only recently learned is that the main reasons antibiotics are administered to these animals is not to prevent or treat disease, but actually for more than 60 years, we have known that subtherapeutic doses of antibiotics to these animals in their feed and in their water leads to increased growth rate and weight gain in a wide variety of livestock, including chickens, pigs, cows, and sheep. And you know, it's speculated that this is likely due to the impact of the antibiotics on the animal's gut microbiome. And there's like an evolutionary conserved relationship between gut microbes and the host. And administering antibiotics to animals disrupts this relationship, altering their metabolism and resulting in weight gain. And you know, of course, the same thing happens in humans. When we take antibiotics, we disrupt our own gut microbiome, which affects not only our metabolism, but our immune system. Will probably alter our set point towards for weight towards overweight or obesity. So the overuse and misuse of antibiotics in animal agriculture leads to antibiotic resistance. And this is especially true when it's used in animal feed and water over a prolonged period of times, which promotes antibiotic resistance development. These bugs are then transmitted to us and colonize our GI tract and colonize our bladders and our urinary tract and colonize our respiratory tract, and then eventually can lead to infectious disease. And this is something I see in the ICU every day. We treat a variety of life-threatening illnesses, including urine and blood infections and pneumonias, and we'll send off a culture to the lab, and it's actually, you know, kind of becoming routine that culture will come back with a bunch of R's next to the sensitivities for antibiotics, meaning resistant. So we will have these multi-drug resistant bugs, which are only susceptible, if we're lucky, to one or two of the most powerful antibiotics in the world. So whereas when I started my practice of medicine, you know, we could get away with, you know, a less powerful antibiotic, we're now throwing these very powerful broad spectrum antibiotics at patients that are killing off their microbiome, but hopefully also killing off this multi-resistant bug. In Canada, it's estimated that approximately 26% of all bacterial infections are resistant to treatment, and that's expected to grow to 40% in 2050. And it's also estimated that in the next 30 years, approximately 400,000 Canadians will be killed by superbugs at a cost to the economy of approximately 400 billion and incalculable human cost. You know, one can easily envision a future where these are almost all the, you know, bugs that we treat are in some way resistant to antibiotics, and that we may run out of powerful antibiotics to use. So we really need to recognize the role of animal agriculture in the development of antibiotic resistance and ensure that the government imposes restrictions on use. Now, this has happened in some countries such as Sweden and Denmark that have now banned all antimicrobial use that is for animal growth, and also imposed restrictions on uses of antimicrobials for treatment. But in Canada, there's only suggestions, guidelines, and encouragement from the government, but no actual regulations yet in place.
Wow, that's very interesting and very informative and very frightening, in fact, about what might be when we enter this post-antibiotic era. Tushar and David, any comments on that question?
I think it's raised a very important question, and I know microbiologists are extremely worried now about what they should be using even in hospital because of this, because of the worry of antibiotic resistance. And in fact, we used to say always take antibiotics for at least the full course of a week or possibly more. There are now suggestions that possibly you get away with this without doing any harm in 3 days. So again, we may be changing our complete antibiotic habits because of the concerns that we've just raised. I think this is tremendously important, and I think it's one of the major issues. I mean, I always used to think when I was a medical student, we've got antibiotics, so we're okay. We just have to worry with viruses, and there aren't too many of those, so let's not bother. Now we're worrying about antibiotics and viruses.
Absolutely, my goodness.
My only comment is that Maria mentioned that 82% of antibiotics in Canada are used for farmed animals and not for humans, but considering the scale of farmed animals in Canada, there's approximately 1 billion animals slaughtered in Canada per year, and at any one time, the number of animals vastly outnumbers the number of humans that are in the country. This may be an underestimate of the amount of antibiotics that are actually used on these farms, considering that it's so ubiquitous, it's continuous usage and whatnot. So the numbers that we get from industry may be very underestimated, and it could be a lot more than this.
Wow. I was reading a report actually from the UK that said that by 2050, 10 million deaths might be caused by antibiotic resistant issues. And to hear that the use of antibiotics may be underestimated, that's interesting. Okay, so we're going to move on to the main part of our discussion now, which is new pathogens and pandemics. The period of the last few decades has been described as the age of emerging plagues, and the UN has said that our two biggest threats to humanity are climate change and emerging infectious diseases. Can you speak to why our current food system practices promote the development of new viruses, new pathogens that can pass from animals to humans? I'll put that out to all of you.
I think maybe a good place to start is, first of all, what happens in nature compared to what happens in our world today because of the action of humans. And to start with, in nature, viruses are generally very benign, right? Like for example, the influenza virus is a virus that affects waterfowl, meaning mainly ducks and geese and whatnot, and exists in their GI tract and infects their GI tract, but doesn't really do any harm to the duck or the goose or whoever's being infected. These birds exist in small population densities, just a few birds here and there, per lake or per pond or whatever it might be. They're not overcrowded. And if a virus was to become very dangerous to the host, then they'd kill off the host, and there wouldn't be any hope of transmitting to the next generation. So the virus would effectively kill itself off if it killed off the host, rather than sort of being in balance with the host. And then when the next generation of ducks or geese comes into that pond, they will gradually get infected by being in the same water, eating the same food, and it goes generation to generation, but not really causing major harm. If there was any dangerous mutation, they might kill off the host, the ducks, but then it would also terminate itself. Now contrast that with human animal agriculture. What humans do is bring together large number of animals that would not normally occur in nature, right? If there were these birds and we have these chicken farms, or we take cattle and we farm cattle in large numbers and enclosed areas, then what happens is that you have these viruses transmitting amongst the other animals that are there. And you have so many animals, you have thousands or millions of animals, that you get mutations when the virus goes from animal to animal. This occurs in nature, but very slowly. But now that you have thousands or millions of animals involved, there's an amplification of the number of viruses. There's an amplification of the number of mutations. In this case, more dangerous mutations that make the animal very sick and cause high numbers of virus to populate throughout the animal system, infect the respiratory tract, and start infecting other animals, and may even kill the animal. those viruses, they will be selected to survive because they will occur in high numbers. And even if it kills its host, it has hundreds of other hosts around it to infect. And the more dangerous viruses have a better chance of surviving because they can spread like wildfire and they can survive more, okay? And that's what happens when you have amplification of the number of mutations, amplification of the number of viruses, and some of those mutations are going to now affect humans because you have the vast number of mutations and some will affect humans. And so that's the distinguishing factor, or the changing set of circumstances from what happens in nature to what happens when animals breed thousands or millions or even billions of animals. And that's why we're getting, basically you can say that when we breed animals, we're breeding viruses too. And the more animals we breed, the more mutations and numbers of viruses that they're going to be. And some of those periodically, every 5, 10, 15 years, are going to cause a dangerous pandemic to humans. In fact, every year there are new viruses that infect humans due to the animals that we breed, but they're not always dangerous. Some of them are make us very sick and have a high mortality rate, but they don't spread very well. So they might kill a few people, but then disappear. Others may spread quite a lot, but they'll be not so dangerous. For example, the flu, influenza A that comes around to us every year kills a number of people, but it's not considered like a pandemic the way COVID is. And so it spreads a lot, but the danger level is somewhat lower, although it does kill some people. But every once in a while, you're going to have a virus that has a high transmissibility as well as a high pathogenicity. It's more dangerous to humans, like COVID-19, like SARS. And this is, or like the H1N1 swine flu that occurred in 2009. And every 5, 10 years, we're going to get something that's more dangerous. And it can, in fact, be much more dangerous than COVID-19 is. And we can talk a little bit more about that afterwards.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tushar. And I think the next question you've already touched upon, would animals in nature cause the same problems anyways? And are bats bad? Unfortunately, they've been really vilified because of their role in the recent COVID-19 pandemic. But to ask that question again, would animals in nature cause the same problems anyway?
Yeah, so it's, go ahead.
Please do, Tushar. I'll follow you. Please go.
Okay, go ahead. Okay, yeah, basically animals in nature harbor some viruses, but they're in balance with each other, they're in balance with themselves, and they're not dangerous to other animals or to themselves. And occasionally they may be, but it's a rare thing. For the most part, they're in balance. And people who live in nature, for example, tribal peoples who live in nature, they generally live in a certain location. They've been living there for a long time, living the same lifestyle for a long time, and they're in balance with their surroundings. It's when we breed animals and we sort of infringe on nature that we get problems. And we can talk a little bit more about the environmental aspects of what we do as well, but it's us causing that. And just a little thing about bats. Bats do harbor a lot of viruses because they live in caves with large populations of other bats, and their immune systems are built to handle it. But they're generally living in their own areas. They may have some interaction with natural animals, but not so much. It's when we create these big barns and huge factory farms that they may enter into these places because they're sort of large cavern-like structures, and bats like that. So you get some bats in there, and their saliva and feces may transmit some virus to domesticated animals that we're breeding, which then amplify those viruses once they're infected and cause mutations and whatnot. But bats on their own don't have a bad effect within nature. They're very much in balance. They serve an incredibly important roles in nature as pollinators and all kinds of ecosystem services in the ecosystems where they reside. So they're not to be vilified. It's only when we create factory farms that you get some virus from a bat affecting our domesticated animals. And it's that mass breeding of animals that really creates these problems.
Thank you. David?
I think I'd like to just endorse what Tushar said. I think the thing that one's finding as one delves more into this, and it's quite fascinating, that many wild animals, birds, especially water birds, waterfowl, bats, many other creatures, have for a long time been harboring viruses. And these viruses, as Tushar says, have over time become benign for them. If they're not benign, they kill them. And as Tushar says, the virus itself doesn't survive. Those viruses, though, are not necessarily benign to us because our metabolism is not exactly the same. So they form, as we sort of encroach into nature, we take out wildlife sanctuaries, we move our own agricultural operations with, as Tushar says, high concentration of animals close to where they are, actually invade and destroy their habitat. Then they are forced out of their normal habitat. And as Tushar says, there are things like bat droppings and these things like this may then be taken up by the species that we eat, and they will infect those species. They may infect them seriously or not so seriously, but when we get infected, we're very seriously infected. So that's a major route. And the other route is simply the effect of repeated generations of viruses in our large animal agriculture situations. So that the chance of mutation is big. And the more you've got, as Tushar said, the more animals you've got together, the greater the chance of one mutation jumping to another, and then mutating further so that one gets even worse types of mutation. So we've got a two-prong. We've got our invasion of the wild, and we've got our own endogenous viruses. So that's, I think, why we're in great pains right now, because we've got a lot of both of these things. We're destroying the environment. We've got large amounts of animal agriculture, and so we've got two time bombs that are exploding at the same time.
Right.
And we're lighting the fuse. We're lighting the fuse.
Absolutely, thank you. Now the next question, Tushar and Marie, you've already touched on a few pandemics that have occurred in the past. Perhaps we could speak about the biggest one that has occurred in the past, just to give us an idea of what might happen in future, the Spanish flu.
Yeah, the Spanish flu isn't necessarily the biggest one that's happened in the past, but it is the biggest one that happened in the 20th century. So 40 million people died approximately around the world due to the Spanish flu at a time when the world population was much smaller than it is right now. So if a million people die today, that could be a small concentration of people, but back then it would be a larger concentration of people. Over 700,000 people died in the USA alone. And there were places that were just devastated, where just a large population, a percentage of the population died. This was essentially a case where the influenza virus that is normally found in ducks and waterfowl got into the farm, farms run by humans that were populated with domesticated animals. So in that time, the farm wasn't as big as they are right now. We have farms right now with hundreds of thousands of animals in one farm. Okay, back then it might be in a few thousand. But these kind of farms located in areas that are also close to natural areas around the US and around the world, there'll be natural animals infecting our domesticated animals. In one such case in the USA, these farmed animals were infected by the waterfowl. And there was some mutations that occurred, obviously, and turned into an influenza virus A that affected humans, and then spread from that US farm and that county to all across the US, and in fact all over the world, and caused a very devastating worldwide pandemic. Okay, and there was basically animal agriculture, collecting animals together so that they can be infected by this virus and then cause mutations and cause amplification of the virus and then jump to humans. And there was also human factors, because in 1918, after World War II, there was a lot of travel that was going around worldwide, not as much as there is today, but there were still soldiers and people traveling around the world and basically then spreading the virus around the world. So all the factors that we discussed were in play here. One, we are putting domesticated animals into areas where they're close to natural animals. There's a jump from one species to another. There's an amplification amongst domesticated animals, a jump from the domesticated animals into humans, and then a spread amongst humans, okay? These things didn't happen as often in the past because we had less number of people and we had relatively less number of farmed animals. So they would happen, you know, slowly every, periodically, the periods would be further apart. But as the human population increases and as our number of animals on our farms increases, they're happening more frequently, and we can see that happening now.
David, I'm going to ask you, because I learned this from you. Why was that pandemic called the Spanish flu?
The Spanish flu, because thank you, that's a good point. And I think it's important for all of us to think about. Propaganda is a big problem. It's a problem always when there's a sort of national panic. There's always propaganda. And this one was no different. And as Tushar said, it's 1918 to 1919. 1918 was the end of the war, and it's said that the flu ended the war, partly because the soldiers were getting too sick. Nobody wanted to talk about sick soldiers, and nobody wanted to own that there was any sickness on their side because it was be seen as weakness in terms of the enemy. So they turned to the only people who could talk about it, which were the Spanish, who weren't in the war. They just didn't happen to be in the war. They said, good heavens, look, we've got this terrible thing, the flu. And so everyone said, yes, you've got this terrible thing, the flu, and now we're getting it. So we must have got it from you. It's therefore the Spanish flu. And so again, and it's persisted to this day, this propaganda has not been put out properly. People still believe that this flu came from Spain. It never did. As Tushar said, it probably came from an American farm taken by American soldiers to the front line in the Great War, and then infecting Europe, infecting America already, and infecting Europe continuously, and moving across Europe to Asia. So again, propaganda, be careful of the propaganda and try and look for the truth.
Absolutely. Excellent. Okay. Maria, go ahead.
Out of the Spanish flu that I was recently reading, just accounts of doctors of what this looked like. And so this is the part that, got me is, the death rate from Spanish flu was much higher than what is for COVID-19, but also the mechanism of death. This so infected the respiratory tract so as to necrose the lungs, and people would die spewing like massive hemoptysis, like accounts of blood, spurting feet across the room, people bleeding from their mucous membranes, and it was called the purple death because of their profound hypoxia, but also I think because of the effect on their blood agglutination system. Anyway, it is very marked to read accounts of this, and I read an account of one hospital director that was writing his local governor, and this is in the U.S., reminding him that there are approximately 1,400 minutes in the day, and they had 1,400 admissions per day for the past few days, thus emphasizing the magnitude of the epidemic. And if we were to admit today 1,400 patients per day to our hospital, that would completely overwhelm our emergency system and ICU. So if we had something with the virulence and death rate of Spanish flu, it would lead to a collapse of our current medical system.
Thank you for bringing that up, because COVID, as bad as it is now, it does feel like it could be a lot worse in future.
And we are basically breeding influenza A every year amongst our farmed animals. And every year we get new variations of genetic mutations of influenza A. And that's why it's one of the big candidates for a future bad pandemic, right? We could have something that could be as more transmissible than COVID-19, and also more dangerous once you get infected. So more pathogenic, it have a higher pathogenicity than COVID-19. And you could have a new variant of flu that is much worse than the swine flu of 2009 going around the world. This is, this is just a matter of time. If we keep breeding so many pigs and chickens, which are the two animals in which the influenza A bounces between those animals continuously around the world, we're going to generate a mutation that is going to become a worse pandemic again.
Yes. I just wanted to say a point on that. Like one chicken can contain thousands of strains of H5N1. Multiply this by billions of chickens on the earth at any given time, and all of those bugs mutating as they do, minutely and hourly. And it does not take much imagination to realize that we are way overdue for, a very deadly and virulent strain of the bird flu or the swine flu. So this, like I said, that type of mutation can occur at any time, and it's kind of remarkable that we haven't faced something worse than COVID-19 already.
Yeah, I think this kind of mutation already exists in the animals. It's just that there are so many mutations of so many viruses existing in all of these farmed animals. It's just requiring the chance for one of them to jump into a human, right? There's millions of strains of these viruses out there. Turn by turn, randomly, they're going to jump into humans. Most of them are not going to be so dangerous, but it's only a matter of time that one of the dangerous ones are going to then infect a human and then spread amongst humans too.
Indeed, and I think that combination of increased transmissibility, increased virulence, it's not an overstatement to say, as Dr. Greger has said already, that it could be the end of civilization as we know it, if that situation arose. So very, very significant. Okay, on to the next question. What is the role of environmental degradation in causing pandemics? We've talked mainly about the animal agriculture, but Tushar, you've touched, and David, you've both touched on environmental degradation as well. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, sure. I think David will follow up on me. So, as I mentioned before, or as we've mentioned before, one of the primary sort of the biogenerator of viruses is having mass animal agriculture. So we're not talking about somebody having a couple of backyard chickens here and there. It's when we have farms that contain thousands or hundreds of thousands or even sometimes millions of animals together, generation after generation. That is the biogenerator of viruses. But then there are environmental things that impacts that humans have, which exacerbate this problem. So as David mentioned, we cause deforestation and we move into the areas, humans move into the areas that were formerly natural places, and we expose ourselves to the animals that are there and the viruses that they have. We create logging roads that go deep into different forests. There is hunting. There's the bushmeat trade that exposes us to different kinds of animals, and that's primarily the way the HIV came to us as well. There is mass human travel all over the world. There is overpopulation of humans that gets everywhere. We push the wild animals into smaller and smaller areas. So the existing wild animals getting pushed into smaller areas also end up transmitting more viruses to each other and generating a few more viruses than they would under other circumstances. And we are also killing off biodiversity, and biodiversity acts as a buffer between us and viruses that are out in nature as well. So as we kill off biodiversity, we basically infringe on nature and get exposed to more different things. So by those different mechanisms, we increase our exposure to viruses that are in the wild, getting into our domesticated animals, and then our domesticated animals multiplying those viruses, generating new mutations.
Thank you. David?
Yes, I think, again, as Tushar said, I follow up. I think what one sees too, things not only just logging, which is a terrible situation, but also our mining situation. We're doing the same thing with our mines. We clear we move into wilderness areas, we clear large places, we build towns, we continue to encroach. Even our cottage country goes into the areas where there are once wilderness areas. All these areas we tend to put under the plough if we can, when we can. And so gradually, we, as Tushar says, we narrow down the biodiversity and the number of species, and we bring ourselves into very close contact with them. I mean, they always used to say that the mosquitoes were there to protect the wilderness from human invasion, but we've managed to actually get past that. So we don't mind we get bitten by the mosquito. We do have zoonotic infections through that. We all know about the West Nile virus. We all know about the other viruses that one can get. We all know about viruses that one can get in so many ways, and it is the viruses and the rickettsia that one has to worry about as part of the zoonotic infection when we destroy the wilderness. So I think we will unleash, as Tushar has just pointed out, we will unleash a whole avalanche, as it were, of viruses as we gradually finish off the natural species on this planet, at which time we're left with a very few species that we use for human food, and the rest of biodiversity gone. So the buffer will have gone, and we'll be left with just concentrations of our own. And so in the end, if Homo sapiens continues to develop the same way it is at present, then the world will naturally take control of itself and finish off Homo sapiens. I mean, we have to be aware that we've only been around as a species for about 180,000 years, which is not long. I mean, the dinosaurs were there a lot longer than we were there. They were finished off not by their own business, but probably by the meteorite, and possibly, it's thought, by viral problems that killed them off. In other words, they were killed off by a plague because they were weakened, because they lived in large concentrations. So again, that seems to be the lesson for the dinosaur. We bring it on ourselves and still live in large concentration. So I think that we've got a message which is very clear to me, that we have to think about sensible family planning. We have to think about respecting the natural environment, and we have to stop eating meat. If we did those three things, then I think we would be fairly well assured of possibly a few and possibly very dispersed pandemics, which might become less and less rather than more and more.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think it's a matter of, there's the things that we know scientifically right now that there's a very, very abundant scientific evidence, and what we can do is we should be sharing that as part of this talk, a really good list of references from where our information is coming from. But there is very, very good information about how breeding animals is breeding viruses, and how our transgressions into nature exacerbate the problem. There's good research of that. We'll share those papers. In terms of what we're predicting in the future, will this, for example, end humanity, or what kind of problems will this cause in the future? We can say with good confidence that we're going to, as we breed more animals, as we continue animal agriculture, we're going to have more pandemics coming, and some of these pandemics are going to be worse. Okay, and we can talk about some of the candidates. We've mentioned that we can have worse coronavirus infections and pandemics. We can have worse influenza pandemics, just as we have had in the past. And there's some others too that we can mention. Whether this will end the human species is difficult to say. It may not end the human species. I'm going to just differ a little bit from David. I'm going to say that's a possibility. But the other possibility is that we can have bad viruses that can cause devastation amongst humans without necessarily ending us as a species. And what that's going to do is it's going to make life miserable on Earth. Let's put it that way, right? It's going to contribute to a large amount of suffering. It's going to contribute to bad conditions of living. It's going to contribute to human conflict. People under these kind of stressful situations fight against each other and have more wars. over limited resources, etc. So even if, you know, humans are tough as hell, it's hard to end us as a species, I believe, but it is very easy for us to become a very miserable species, you know, and that's what we don't want. So there are good solutions to this, as David mentioned, and that is we should stop breeding all these animals. You know, mass animal agriculture causes these problems clearly, and the only way to prevent these problems is to reduce or eliminate mass animal agriculture. We can talk about vaccines and all these different kind of things, but that's always going to lag behind an initial period of, you know, bad, you know, and devastating illness and consequences.
Thank you. And actually, that's a nice segue into the next part. Maria, I'm going to ask you about the next question. Can you, just talking more specifically about COVID-19 now, can you speak to the people who are getting more severe cases of COVID-19, how their comorbidities are affecting their outcomes?
Yeah, so, you know, first of all, you know, one of the greatest risks is with age. So there's a significant increase in risk of hospitalization and mortality with each decade above 20. So there's a 13 times higher risk in an 85-year-old of hospitalization and a 630 times higher risk of death if someone in their mid-80s gets COVID-19. And that's why we've seen these terrible outcomes at nursing homes combined with the terrible conditions there. Children appear to be at very minor risk, except for, you know, a syndrome where their immune system gets revved up and as a result of COVID. But the greatest risk is to our older population, and, you know, 80% of the deaths are those 65 and older. Comorbidities or other illnesses that put you at increased risk of hospitalization include asthma, hypertension, and obesity, which triples your risk. Diabetes also triples your risk of hospitalization. CKD, 4 times the risk of hospitalization. Chronic kidney disease. Having any 2 of these conditions or 3 of these conditions places you at 4 to 5 times increased risk of hospitalization. So, you know, having a comorbidity does place you at increased risk. Ones I didn't mention yet: COPD, heart disease, immunocompromised state. All of those are associated with worse outcomes. The thing is that, and I think that might lead into the next question, there is hope to mitigate your risk, and maybe I'll let you ask that question.
Yes, I shall ask that question right now then. So how can we impact our resilience to COVID-19? How does our food system impact our resilience as well? I'll stay with you for now, Maria.
Yeah, so basically, aside from the best line of defense, which is social distancing combined with mask wearing, combined with frequent hand hygiene, our main defense against any infectious pathogen is our immune system. So the immune system is composed of various organs, such as our lymph tissues, white blood cells, proteins called antibodies that attack against foreign invaders. One of the interesting things is that 70% of our immune system resides in the gut. And that's where our gut microbiome is, all those friendly or potentially non-friendly bacteria that reside in our gut. And we have just a very thin layer, one single epithelial layer that separates our inside world from our outside world. So everything that we ingest that is potentially contaminated with these zoonotic illnesses goes in through our mouth and travels through our GI tract. And you know, what we have is just this thin layer that is protecting us from getting these zoonotic illnesses. And I'm not specifically speaking out of COVID-19, but I just want to sort of lay the groundwork. But our gut microbiome helps to keep our gut lining healthy, to prevent it from becoming leaky and allowing bacterial endotoxins to get in. And, you know, the things we eat very much impact our gut microbiome. So when we're eating whole plant foods that contain fibers and resistant starches, we're allowing the good bacteria to proliferate. And those good bacteria produce something called short chain fatty acids, which help to protect our gut lining and to keep the tight junctions between those epithelial cells shut, so that, you know, the foreign invaders can't get in. The short chain fatty acids also help to cool off our immune response. So they inhibit inflammatory signals such as TNF alpha. And this, it occurs to me that, what's happening in COVID when we get this cytokine storm, we need something to cool off our immune system. And one would hope that if one has a good gut microbiome and producing good short chain fatty acids, that you would have some of these mitigating factors in there. So what can we do specifically for COVID-19 to help to raise our immune response? Well, so for the foods we eat. So if we eat predominantly a whole foods, plant-based diet with a focus on fresh fruits and vegetables, nuts and seeds, legumes, whole grains. But there's some specific good players for helping your immune system, such as cruciferous vegetables, berries, mushrooms, and the foods high in fibers and resistant starches that feed our intestinal microbiota and combat dysbiosis. Another thing that maybe people don't realize is exercise. So regular physical activity improves immune function and lowers risk of respiratory tract infections. So they've done studies of elderly sedentary women, and even a half hour per day will decrease their risk of upper respiratory tract infection from 50% to 20%. Moderate exercise boosts IgA in saliva. That's something we can measure, and this protects against respiratory tract infections. One caveat is, however, that intense sustained exercise, such as endurance sports and marathons, and ultra marathons, that can impair your immune system. So subjects that run marathons report higher rates of respiratory tract infections in the days and weeks after a marathon. And that's like a 2 to 6 fold increase of upper respiratory tract infections. So probably not a good idea to be running any marathons or ultra marathons right now. The other big thing, of course, is sleep. So sleep deprivation impairs the immune system. And for all of us who have done that brutal on-call, which I think probably includes everyone on this panel, they've done studies where they inoculate rhinovirus in subjects and then expose them to different amounts of sleep deprivation. And those sleeping 7 hours, infection rate was only 18%, whereas those sleeping 5 hours would have infection rates as high as 50%. So that's a nasty experiment to conduct, but I believe at UC San Francisco did that. So stress reduction also associated with improved immune system. And Dean Ornish, in his book, what was it called, Love and Survival, cites numerous studies demonstrating the impact of a loving relationship on immune health. So, the fact that we're social distancing right now may actually be having some negative impact. There are some associations with certain vitamins and minerals, and I get asked this all the time. Are there any vitamins I can take that will help my immune system? There are some published data on worse outcomes in COVID-19 with certain vitamin deficiencies, particularly vitamin D. Another report from China of worst outcomes in COVID with low selenium. So, eat your Brazil nuts, take your vitamin D supplements, get out in the sun. Other supplements that may be helpful, there's some researchers at McGill that have been looking at quercetin. Now, quercetin is a plant flavonoid with demonstrated antiviral activity. And just to let you know, a lot of my colleagues and I are now popping quercetin, but I believe I get most of my quercetin from my plant-based diet. But I have been suggesting this to my more friends. There's some evidence for zinc and vitamin C in viral infections, but nothing specific with respect to COVID-19 yet. There are some case reports of better outcomes with high dose IV vitamin C in intubated patients, but those are just case reports, and there's no firm recommendations yet with respect to any of these supplements with the exception of vitamin D.
Thank you. That was very comprehensive. I may have missed it. Did you mention smoking?
Oh, sorry. Yes. Don't smoke.
Don't smoke. Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, Maria. That was great. I'll move on to the next question, and we've briefly touched on this. So has all the money that we have poured in given us a cure or a treatment? And what about vaccines? David, I'll put that to you first.
Thank you. That's a difficult one. I wish I could be the bearer of good news. There are some drugs that are looking promising. Remdesivir has looking a bit promising in an NIH study and one or two other studies. But when we say they look promising, they show maybe a 30% reduction in duration. We have nothing that I know, and I will stand corrected, nothing that we know of that even has made a fraction of a difference in terms of mortality. So that, I think, is bad news. We are early days, but as you say, there's been a lot of money. So in terms of dollar per year, we've certainly put in an enormous amount of dollar years in this particular program, and we've seen very little. We do see some hope, possibly, with immunotherapy, but vaccination, to be honest, or immunization, is still, I think, a long way off in terms of practical reality, because all we can say is that there seem to be IgG responses. How long these are maintained, the actual data on second infections for those who've been infected once is not clear, so that we don't know whether when you've been infected, unless you've been infected very severely, whether that infection will actually confer the sort of immunity you want. And when we have a vaccine, because these vaccines may be short-lived, we don't know whether there may have to be multiple vaccinations throughout the year. So I think we are in a difficult situation where the drugs that we've got are not really showing tremendous promise. There may be some small hope, but many of them fail. And those that do, a few, and their effects have not been marked. We're putting, I think, most of our faith right now in the fact that we'll have some good immunization program in the future. But again, how long that's going to take, I don't know.
Thank you. Any other comments on that?
I just will add, that like as David said, in the ICU, our main support is it's just supportive care, oxygen, ventilatory support. There's no evidence that giving broad spectrum antibiotics to prevent superimposed infection does any good. There is some evidence for improved outcomes or reduced mortality in hospitalized COVID patients that are on oxygen or mechanical ventilation with a 10-day course of dexamethasone. And that's an immune suppressant that is meant to suppress the cytokine storm effects. But again, really everything else that was looked at, remdesivir, hydroxychloroquine, of course, no benefit or possible harm. Unfortunately, convalescent plasma didn't turn out to have sufficient evidence, and these immune globulins. As for a vaccine, it's incredible for me to consider the short time frame with which these vaccines are being developed and have achieved phase 3 trials. Like the average length of development is 11 years. One wonders about the safety of pushing something through so fast. And then there's the logistical consideration of distributing a vaccine to the global population. I'm not pinning all my hope on a vaccine right now for reasons that David also described.
Tushar, anything to add? Oh, we can't hear you, Tushar.
Sorry, there was some background noise. I turned my microphone off. Okay, so, just like so many things, we do something that causes a problem, and then we try to create a cure for it that is not perfect, right? So we have all these environmental problems that are caused by our overconsumption, overpopulation, overuse of everything on Earth, and then we try to create some technology that might fix it, but it's not just a technology that'll fix it. We have to actually stop doing these things, right? Same with our health. We want to eat all kinds of fats, animal products, refined carbohydrates, and then have medications that compensate for the problems that we have created, right? Instead of going back to a very healthy diet and using science to help us with that healthy diet, of course. Trying to have technological fixes for our bad behaviors. And then this is the same kind of example. If we focus completely on vaccines and medications, which it's fine, we should develop vaccines, we should try to look at medications that can help us since we've had this problem. But we also have to look at not creating this problem in the first place. And that means to reduce or one day even eliminate mass animal agriculture and to stop our intrusion into natural spaces and continue to diminish and erode the remaining natural spaces on Earth. Okay, so as Dr. Michael Greger says, the best way to deal with a pandemic is not to have one in the first place, right? And that's, and we should use our science and our knowledge towards refraining, using our knowledge to change our behavior rather than, and for all the focus that we put on vaccines, we should put equal or more focus on the cause of this problem in the first place. We always talk about the results and the after effects, but we're not talking enough about the cause and how to then not cause in the future.
And that leads us nicely on to the next question, which you've in part answered. What can we as individuals or as a society do to prevent these new pathogens and future pandemics?
Well, I think as individuals, we've had limited success changing the will of our politicians. I mean, it really requires wide-scale political change and a groundswell from the ground up to get our politicians to listen. And, we're seeing that with climate change and the effects of, one little girl, Greta Thunberg, able to mobilize thousands of people in protest. And, the similar scale needs to occur for animal agriculture. But, I think the most impactful thing that we can do as individuals is to change our individual behaviors and to, affect the system by creating a demand or a lack of demand. So, if we were to all shift to a more plant-based diet, that would create less demand for animal products and hopefully impact the agricultural system, which we're already seeing with major animal producers shifting to the production of plant-based proteins. So that's, one thing that we can do is, to protest with our consumerism and our wallets, to buy less, to eat less meat, and, to generally try and preserve the environment and shift to more plant-based animal agriculture.
David.
Well, I agree with what everyone said, obviously. I do think that there are two approaches. I think the approach when we're doing things together, and I think the approach of taking on individual responsibility. I think those two things have to be done in harmony, because I think the political system is resistant and we have to make it change. And I think that's really the big thing. And if one is, as it were, clean oneself, and if one can congregate with one's friends, and unfortunately, this virus is going to stop us from having a congregation. I have to say, I went to my first demonstration outside Queen's Park last, what was it, September, November, or something like that, October. And I was most impressed at the range of people there, the ages, parts of the globe they'd come from, wherever they were all there, lots of children, all complaining. And they're wonderful placards like, the globe isn't Uranus, keep it clean. And I thought this was good. And another one said, the dinosaurs didn't see it coming either. I mean, so lots of placards and lots, I think, of very strong feeling. And I think the ability to show those strong feelings and to go away then and lead one's life and literally vote with one's pocketbook as to what one buys and what one does, I think is tremendously important. And I would like to say that those of us who have a few dollars to spare, please support wildlife and other good causes, because I think that's important. Support PETA, support all the other groups that are trying to do something in a more humane fashion. So I think we have to actually get involved. I think that's the truth. One has to be involved and stay involved.
Absolutely. Tushar, any final thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I just want to reiterate that there is personal change. Of course, we can become more plant-based ourselves, but we also concurrently want systemic change. So we want to encourage people to experiment and try to increase their proportion of healthy plant-based foods, right? Not the unhealthy ones, but the healthy ones mainly, and to learn about that. But then we want to promote systemic change, because that's what really, a random person going, more plant-based here and there is one thing, but the overall amount of animal agriculture to decrease requires systemic changes. So just, remember, we should be working on both things. Both are important. And the other thing is that we should note very firmly in our minds that until now, I've always thought that there were three reasons that people would choose a plant-based diet. One could be ethical reasons. Another could be health reasons. We have very, very strong evidence that a healthy, proper, whole food plant-based diet is beneficial for many of our chronic diseases and important diseases, okay? And environmental reasons. But now pandemics is the fourth big reason that we should choose plant-based. And when people are having these conversations in society with each other, right, remember there are four big reasons. Now, somebody may not be interested in one. They may not care so much about health. They may not care so much about ethics, but they may care about one or the other reasons. But pandemics now is one solid reason why the world needs to also go more plant-based.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful place to finish this panel. We've only touched the surface, obviously, on these big, big questions, but you've given us all a lot to think about. Thank you all for your time and for your expertise. It's been a lot of fun. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Oh, and one more thing.
Oh.
By the way, everything that we say, we want to back up with scientific evidence. So if you go to plantbaseddata.org, okay, there's a whole section there about pandemics and zoonotic diseases. So that section is always growing, but it has all the major papers where we talk about influenza, Spanish flu, the different types of coronavirus, that's MERS, SARS 2002, COVID, and other major pandemics that have gone across the globe, and it has the most important papers there, and you can see them all categorized. So it shouldn't just be us talking compared to anybody else talking and just listening to what we say. What we say is backed up by scientific evidence, and we want to tell you where the source is so you can go and look it up for yourself.
Wonderful. Thank you, Tushar. Thank you, everyone.
Zahra,
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you.